Okay, so welcome everybody. I think I'm kicking us off just to say hello and welcome. We're in the webinar mode of Zoom, so we can't see all of the participants. So if you have any questions, do put them in the chat, and we might not be able to get to you during the session, but we will come back to you later if we need to. So just to thank everybody for joining, and to thank all of the panelists and speakers for joining us today as well. And I think without further ado, we'll just get started. So I would like to hand over to Ole Sander from the International Rice Research Institute to kick things off.
Hello and good morning to everybody. I will just share my screen. I hope you can see my slides now. My name is Björn Ole Sander. I'm a senior scientist in climate change with the International Rice Research Institute. And I'm also leading the development of a new CGIAR initiative on securing the food systems of the Asian Mega-Deltas for climate and livelihood resilience. And today I will give a very brief background on climate change and the deltas. So why focusing on the Mega-Deltas, and then show the design of this new program. What you see here are the latest IPCC projections of sea level rise from the 2019 report. And you see, depending on which scenario we take, we can expect sea level increases of 0.6 to 1.1 meter. Here I showed you the other graph from 20 years ago, where the IPCC has also made climate change, sea level rise projections. And you see they projected increases of 0.2 to 0.7 meters. So the new ones are of course much more accurate. And what does that mean? It means that the best outcome we can hope for now is the horror scenario from 20 years ago. And who really thinks that we will be managing towards the best outcomes possible? What does that mean in terms of deltas? You may have seen these projections from about 2 years ago, where Kulp and Strauss have looked at the coastal elevation of the world. And I didn't know that either. There was a lot of uncertainty in terms of elevation data of our coasts. And they found actually that many areas are much lower and elevated than previously assumed. So they made here projections for the Mekong Delta for 2050 on the left-hand side with the old elevation data, on the right-hand side with the new elevation data, showing what parts of the delta will be below the highest tide point of sea level. And others made similar studies looking at artificial intelligence supported new estimations, and again found also for the Mekong Delta that it's probably much lower elevated than we previously assumed, and the land is sinking. Now, what does that mean? It means that the deltas of the world will be much more vulnerable to sea level rise. And I've also looked at some projections for the deltas that we aim to focus on. So in the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, for example, we can expect a significant decrease in the area suitable for agriculture, 11 to 30%. In Myanmar's Irrawaddy Delta, the dry season crop yield is estimated to be significantly reduced. And in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, a sea level rise of only 0.5 meters, it could be double. 0.5 meters would mean that 37% of the delta would be below the sea level. Now that's the reason why the CGIAR has said we need to focus much more strongly on these very important agro environments that are so much under stress. And that's why we designed with hundreds of local stakeholders these 5 work packages. So in order to improve climate and livelihood resilience, we will focus on, in work package 1, on adapting deltaic production systems. So clearly agronomic lens together with local communities, looking at, with the new climate change projections, what can be produced where and how. Work package 2 comes from the consumer side and looks at the nutritional values of the deltaic food systems. And the approaches developed in work packages 1 and 2 will be supported by work package 3, 4, and 5. Work package 3 looking at smart investments in digital solutions to de-risk key value chains. So, for example, focusing on digital climate advisory services. Work package 4 will develop much more inclusive natural resource governance and empowering local communities to take part. And work package 5 will synthesize all the results from the other work packages and try to work with national stakeholders on a more evidence-based delta development planning. And I will end with 2 calls for action. You see here, Ban Ki-moon says we will need more data for clearly targeting interventions among smallholder farmers. And we'll need much more demand-driven research and innovation. And Bill Gates also recognizes we need new tools for fighting climate change. We will need new seeds and also new other innovations. And with this new Mega-Deltas initiative of the CGIAR, we hope to address these calls for action. And now I'm handing over, so thank you very much for your attention. I'm handing now over to my colleague, Professor Andy Large from Newcastle University. He's the director of the Living Deltas Hub. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Ole, and welcome everybody to our session. I'll just start the slides. There we go. Thank you very much, Ole. Following on from Ole's introduction to CGIAR, I'll just take a few minutes to introduce the UKRI GCRF Living Deltas Hub. We work in 3 nations. We work over 4 delta social ecological systems. Some have been mentioned already by Ole. We work in the Red River, the Mekong Delta, and the GBM Delta between India and Bangladesh. We ask ourselves 2 key questions. How are deltas changing? What are the key trends and changes that are occurring in deltas globally? We've seen huge changes worldwide, and we also seek to quantify the key drivers behind those change. We learn from lived experience to build a better future with delta dwellers. We seek to work in a transdisciplinary way to capacity strengthen, to raise delta voices, which traditionally have been unheard. And we need to understand complex relationships between people's heritage, how people work now, and the effect human activities and environmental change will have on these landscapes. We, along with CGIAR, use equitable partnerships to raise resilience. We define those as working relationships and collaborations where there's mutual benefit and equal value placed on each partner's contribution. We believe also in terms of co-creating change, using locally relevant adaptive capacity to draw on local knowledge to create the cultural heritage-based understanding essential to strengthen delta people's ability to adapt to the huge changes posed by global climate change. And to do that, we work on ecosystem services, understanding at the same time that that term itself might mean little to delta dwellers, and we look towards nature-based solutions for delta futures. Areas where we work are on mangrove restoration, as these are essential buffers to major change. We're working across landscapes to look at landscape scale change. We're dealing with sustainable agriculture. We're dealing with aquaculture on organic farming. And we're working with delta communities to produce and implement the systems to develop safe, sustainable food resources, particularly in the delta areas. We research ways to mitigate and adapt the effects of the change that Ollie has described by trying to understand what sustainable delta livelihoods look like. And to do this, we draw on local natural cultural heritage. This is the glue that binds communities to their landscapes, and we seek to learn lessons from the past, to draw on knowledge bases, to produce locally relevant policies for sustainable delta management. And that's key in the face of biodiversity loss and climate change. In terms of our work streams, our first one looks to raise voices of the deltas. We seek a participatory approach to explore the relationship between youth and aging, to deal with youth livelihoods and delta futures. Our second looks at behavior and risk. We look at integrated risk assessment frameworks for delta social ecological systems and look at knowledge gaps and gather data for effective delta monitoring. Our third work stream assesses and quantifies how human impacts are changing delta ecosystems in terms of water quality, flood risk, and ecosystem response. And we're just developing the first systemic monitoring of the West Bengal Delta. Our fourth looks at the coastal fringes of deltas, which are among our most vulnerable landscapes, and can act as early warning systems for the entire delta systems, and we characterize their tipping points and identify risks and opportunities for coastal areas. We are looking at the SDGs and making delta frameworks SDG relevant. This is the SDG view is conceptualized by the Stockholm Resilience Center, but environment gets squeezed in the real world. We need to look at society and economy together to build circular economies, more equitable societies. And as opposed to the Stockholm Resilience Center model, we put partnerships at the center of our model, equitable partnerships. And only then can we begin to address the biosphere degradation that we see on deltas. And finally, we are a transdisciplinary hub. We have a balanced approach, blending the social sciences, natural sciences, and physical science, and arts and humanities on an equal basis. And so, as I say, we're a transdisciplinary rather than an interdisciplinary one, as solving the wicked problems facing Asian megadeltas requires a fundamentally different landscape-oriented and community-inclusive response. And I'll leave it there. So today, Monday, the 8th of November, marks the Adaptation, Loss and Damage Day set out by the UK COP26 presidency to highlight the need to adapt and to step up action on loss and damage resulting from extreme weather and slow onset events. And one of the key questions of today is how do we build bridges for inclusive resilience? A later session today will look at how we build in climate justice, global south underrepresentation, and also deal with lack of investment in policies and programs. So if you can go on the COP26 platform, there will be more sessions today. But one of the things we want to really do in this session is raise the voices of the Delta dwellers. Apparently my alarm can be heard, but I have no alarm going off here. So the key question is how do we raise the voices of the Delta dwellers? And here we'd like to present a short video which brings some of those voices to the table. So if that could be played now, please.
এ তো কোডুক আছে, এ তো একটু যাবি।
কোনো অভাব ছিল না, আর এখন প্রচুর অভাব।
জলবায়ু পরিবর্তনের কারণে বাপ-দাদার ভিটে আর পেশা ছাড়তে হয়েছে অনেককেই, হতে হয়েছে উদ্বাস্তু। যেমন বাগেরহাটের বেলায়েত আলী। প্রলয়ঙ্কারী এক ঘূর্ণিঝড় আইলা কয়েক বছর আগে কেড়ে নিয়েছে তার সব সর্বস্ব হারিয়ে শত মাইল দূরে খুলনার জয়পুর চরে জীবনযুদ্ধ এখন বেলায়েতের।
তাই এখন অভাবই একরকম বলতে হবে, এখন অভাব বেশি সর্বদিক থেকে। মান সম্মানও খুব একটা থাকতেছে না এই বিদেশে।
হঠাৎ করেই অভিবাসী হওয়া এরকম মানুষ এখন অনেক বাংলাদেশে। গত এক দশকে কেবল উপকূলবর্তী এলাকাতেই বাস্তুহারা হয়েছে লাখো বাংলাদেশি।
যেই বর্ষাকাল আসে সেই এরকম ডুবে ডুবে যায়, আবার আর যখন গন চলে যায় সামনে একটু জাগে, এইভাবে মানুষ বাঁচে।
နောက်သူကဒီတိုင်းဒေသမှာဆက်ခဲဆုံးကတော့သဘာဝအန္တရာယ်ပေါ့ရုပ်တရက်မိုးကြီးချင်းဒီတိုက်ချင်းဒါတွေကတော့စိုက်ပျိုးကဏ္ဍတွေကတော့အခါသာတောင်ဖြစ်တဲ့ကိစ္စတွေတော့ဆက်ခဲကတော့အဲ့ဒါပါဒီမှာပဲဖြစ်ပေါ်လာသဘာဝအန္တရာယ်လို့အဲ့ဒါကျွန်တော်တို့ရောက်တိုင်းဒီပြပုံခဲရိုင်းပြပုံမျိုးနဲ့မှနေရတာတော့ဟိုးရင်းနေတွေတော့ဒီတိုင်းလို့ကောင်းပါလေရာဒီလူတွေမှတော့ကလည်းကောင်းတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့အခုနည်းနည်းတော့မှတော့ရာလူတွေမကောင်းတဲ့အတွက်စပါးလေးစံတွေလည်းမကောင်းဘူးလေယာလွှမ်းလုံးတွေလည်းရာလူမကောင်းတဲ့အတွက်ကျွန်တော်မကောင်းတဲ့အတွက်ကျွန်တော်လည်းဓမ္မကြီးမှာတော့ဒီနောက်ပိုင်းနှစ်တွေမှာတော့ဒုက္ခရောက်ပါလို့တတိယပေါ့ဒီ
တရားဥတိုင်းဒေသကြီးမြို့ဝကျော်ထိသားမှာနေထိုင်ရပြီးတော့အခက်အခဲကြုံတွေ့နေရတာတော့အဲ့ဒါလမ်းမဆက်သွယ်ရေးအဓိကဖြစ်ပါတယ်လမ်းမဆက်သွယ်ရေးလေယာလုပ်ငန်းဝင်မှာလည်းအဲ့ဒါဟိုရေချောင်းမြောင်းအင်းအိုင်တွေမှာຫນွေတိတက်မှာလည်းမရဘူးမိုးတဲ့ဆိုရင်ရေကြီးတယ်ຫນွေတိတက်ဆိုလည်းရေလုံလောက်မှုမရရှိပါဘူးဒီနဲ့ကိုလုံနဲ့ကိုလုပ်ငန်းခွင်နဲ့ကိုရွာလေးနဲ့တော့ကတော့ဆိုင်းတောက်ရည်နေထိုင်ရတော့အကုန်လုံးအဆင်ပြေပါတယ်အဓိကတော့လမ်းမဆက်သွယ်ရေးအဲ့ဒါမြို့နဲ့တောနဲ့တွားရေးလာရေးအခက်အခဲတွေအများကြီးရှိပါတယ်
နောက်တစ်ချက်ကတော့ကျွန်တော်လေယာကိုဘယ်လိုကောင်းလဲဆိုတော့ဘုံလုံးကလို့တော့မဟုတ်တော့ဘူးပေါ့နော်ကိုယ်ပိုင်ကိုလုပ်ပြီးတော့ကိုယ့်ဘက်ကိုရတဲ့ဒီကိုယ့်ဘက်ကိုကျောင်းစာဘုံလုံးကတော့တောင်းကြီးရောင်းရတာပါလို့ပေါ့နော်ဟုတ်ပါတယ်အဲ့တော့နောက်ဒီငါးသားပထွန်ကြတော့လေတော်တော်ရှားတယ်စဉ်းစားကြိုးစားလောက်ပဲ
ချောင်းမြောင်းနေရလဲအများကြီးရှိတော့ရှာဖွေရတာလွယ်ကူတာပေါ့ခုနကရှာဖွေရတာခက်ခဲသွားတယ်ပိတ်ဆို့တွေများလာငါးတွေလည်းရှားသွားပြီဓမ္မတွေများတော့ငါးတွေပြုံးပြီးတော့ရှားလို့မလွယ်တော့ဖားစီရတယ်များလာတော့ရှားတာစင်မတည်တော့
ကျမတို့ဒီ ARV တိုင်းဒေသကြီးမှာနေထိုင်ရတဲ့ဟိုပါကောင်းတဲ့အချက်တွေကတော့လမ်းမဆက်သွယ်ရေးကလည်းအရင်ကထက်ကောင်းလာတယ်တွားလာတွေကလည်းလွယ်ကူလာတယ်အင်တာနက်လိုင်းတွေကလည်းနေရာတိုင်းလိုမှာဟိုเนาะအသုံးပြုလို့ရတဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်ပို့ပြီးတော့အဆင်ပြေလာပါတယ်ဒီတိုင်းမှာနေထိုင်ရတဲ့အတွက်တော့ခက်ခဲရပါတော့။ရင်ကငါးတွေဖမ်းရတာလွယ်ကူတယ်။ရောင်းချရတာလည်းလွယ်ကူတယ်။အခုဖက်မှာဆိုရင်တော့ငါးတွေဖမ်းရတာခက်ခဲတွေရှိတာတယ်။ဥပဒေတွေကလည်းထုတ်ပြန်ထားတဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်ဟိုပေါ့နော်ဖမ်းနေတဲ့အချိန်လည်းဖမ်းလို့မရတော့ဘူး။အခက်အခဲတွေရှိရပေါ့နော်။
Võ Văn Sĩ là nông dân trồng lúa ở ấp Thạch Lộc, xã Trung Thạnh, huyện Cờ Đỏ, thành phố Cần Thơ. Tôi rất vui khi sống ở nơi khu vực đồng bằng sông Cửu Long, cây trái xanh tươi, đồng lúa bát ngát bốn mùa, là vụ lúa lớn nhất đồng bằng sông Cửu Long. Và trong cái đời sống của bà con thì rất thân thiện, tình làng nghĩa xóm, biết tương thân ái, giúp đỡ lẫn nhau trong những cái việc khó khăn. Và đồng thời trong đó thì có những cái điều kiện bất lợi, những cơn mưa trái mùa làm ảnh hưởng đến năng suất của cây trồng. Và đồng thời thì vào mùa khô thì cũng có những cái nơi thiếu nước và cũng ảnh hưởng khu vực đồng bằng sông Cửu Long, cũng ảnh hưởng đến thời tiết như là khô hạn, xâm nhập mặn, làm ảnh hưởng đến sản xuất của bà con nông dân trồng lúa.
We've just had a question in the chat. Could this be made available for people to share with the students? Yes, of course. It's on. We have a copy on video, and we'll make that available certainly. So just to follow on, we move to a session where we have a number of distinguished speakers to give us more background to excuse me, to resilience, food security, how we localize the SDGs in deltas, and hopefully, although one of our speakers we think is still on the train, we'll have a talk, a small short session on locally led adaptation, which is a key to climate resilience in the deltas. But moving on, that speaker fortunately is the last in our four. We have four speakers, and our first is Dr. Hui Li. Dr. Hui Li is a senior researcher and lecturer from the Vietnam National University, the Central Institute for Natural Resources and Environmental Studies, or CRES. Based in Hanoi, Hui's research focuses on natural resource management, on land tenure, and gender, and in particular looks at the differentiating effects of Delta macro policy and looks at how social differentiation and power relations affect the way in which different classes of people use and can access Delta resources. Hui's just recently published a book called Competing for Land, Mangroves and Marine Resources in Vietnam, and it's with great pleasure that I invite Hui to talk to us this morning.
Hui, you're still on mute.
I'm sorry. It is my great pleasure today to present to you the case study from the Red River Delta in Vietnam. And through the case study, you can see why we need to merge social and physical science in practice and how this has contributed to increase resilience in the Red River Delta within the framework of the Living Deltas Hub that Andy has presented to you earlier. Now I would like to present to you some features about the Red River Delta. The delta represents 5% of Vietnam's land, but support 30% of the population. There are 24 million people living and work in the river delta, in the Red River Delta Basin. The majority of people are engaged in rice cultivation, forestry, and aquaculture. Located at the forefront of the climate change, the livelihoods and the life of people here are affected by seasonal storms, drought, coastal erosion, and saline intrusion. What about the impacts of flood in the Red River Delta? The vulnerability to flood event is highest in certain livelihood sectors such as agriculture and aquaculture, and almost 600 houses in the Red River Delta were affected by tropical clone incidents between the last 10 years. 43% of agriculture, including rice fields, were lost between 2008 and 50% of the total rice, in the Red River Delta were inundated due to storm. There are some figures, but I don't think that I'm going to read it to you, but you can see that the floods has caused a lot of damage to the lives and livelihoods of the people in the Red River Delta. The drought also has caused a lot of damage to the people here over the past 54 years. And then the drought intensity is likely to be significant by the end of the 21st century. And of course, the drought events have been increased due to depletion of water resources, due to increasing demand for water for daily uses and also for agricultural production purposes. And of course, recently, due to industrial production purposes. Here we can see the dead mangroves. This photo that we took in one of our field trips to the Red River Delta. All the mangroves here were uprooted. So in this project, as Andy mentioned earlier, I don't want to repeat it again, but we also characterize coastal social ecological tipping points and co-develop with a wide range of stakeholders, potential delta scale interventions to avoid negative and facilitate positive tipping points transitions. So we hope that with this, in this project, we can use, the natural cultural heritage approaches toward the sustainable development goals attainment. And we realize that only when using both physical and social physicals in and social science in practice can we deliver multi solutions, disciplinary solutions to disaster risk in the Red River Delta. Here is one of our example that physical scientists have done. We use, the mini buoys to assemble, device. It is a very easy to use device for long-term monitor waves inundation in coastal settings, and then we can identify where would be the best place to plant the mangroves, because in the Red River Delta these days, a lot of places are not suitable for planting mangroves, and then the survival rate is very low. Only 10% of the newly planted mangroves could survive. So the mini buoys, are very important in that sense, because it provides us the data and then the information where we could use, for the better macro restoration models. As social scientists, we complement, the physical scientists in the way that we interview the local communities. We conducted key informant interviews and also focus group discussion, and also we conducted community mapping exercise. Here you can see that local people were very interested in the exercise, as I showed us the important places in the mangroves where we could catch the clams, the fish, and bivalves. And you can see that the animals were also, were raising in the mangroves. So the project helped us better understand the local knowledge, the farming practices, and how the village have coped with natural disasters, but also how they have coped with regulation imposed from above. We as physical and social scientists, we work together with the local government, local communities. Together we co-produce initiatives that ensure sustainable agriculture and successful mangrove restoration in the Delta. Some good examples are here you can see that because we can use the data from the mini buoys that I mentioned earlier to identify the suitable places for planting mangroves to ensure that the survival rate would be high, so that the mangrove forestation restoration would be successful in the Delta. The other example here you can see the pond is a sustainable extensive shrimp farming pond, and then it's amazing that the mangroves also survive in the middle of the pond, because in this model they use the water gates system. They open and close it depending on the tide, where the tide is in and where the tide is out, so they can close or open the gate accordingly. The other model is integrated agricultural aquaculture model. With this one, we use the garden, the pond, livelihood pen, and with this model, we can use effectively all the available land, air, water, and solar energy resources, and also effectively recycle byproducts and waste for providing diversified agricultural products to meet the complex nutritional demands of rural communities. The next model is the rice fish model, and this model is much better than 2 crops of rice per year. And then the last one is the new varieties that resilient to flood and salinity have been bred in the Delta. With all of this, we hope that we can work closely with the local communities so that we can create together a sustainable Delta. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wei, for that very interesting talk and illustration of some of the work going on. And I was interested at the end at how you talked about the implications for people's nutrition. And so I'd like to move on to our next speaker, who's Shakuntala Thilsted, Shakuntala is the research program leader for value chains and nutrition at WorldFish, and is a specialist in nutrition sensitive approaches to aquatic food systems. Shakuntala joined WorldFish in 2010, has more than 25 years experience in research. And in May 2021, it was announced that Shakuntala would be a recipient of the World Food Prize for 2021. That's an international award recognizing the achievements of individuals who've advanced human development by improving the quantity, quality, or availability of food in the world. And in fact, the World Food Prize has come to be known as the Nobel Prize for Food and Agriculture. So we're honored to have Shakuntala here with us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. And now I'd invite Shakuntala to talk to us. Thank you very much.
Greetings to all, and thank you, Andy, for your kind introduction. As I present on food and nutrition security in the Asian Mega-Deltas, my colleague Donia Hussein will present some background slides that feature the diversity of Asian Mega-Deltas. And diversity is essential for all what we do with respect to improving food and nutrition security, not only in the Asian Mega-Deltas, but throughout. The Asian Mega-Deltas, as we all know, are crucial for providing food and nutrition for millions. Alone in the Delta, the data suggests that there are 177 million people living across these deltas. At the same time, the Asian Mega-Deltas provide vast amount of foods and nutrition for many people outside the deltas, within the countries themselves, peri-urban and urban population groups, and just think about the megacities that are dependent on these Asian Mega-Deltas for food. Dhaka, Kolkata, Ho Chi Minh City, Yangon, Bangkok, and also regionally and beyond the region. We export food from the Asian Mega-Deltas to many countries. The Asian Mega-Delta embody diverse and productive food, land, and water systems, supplying very many diverse, nutritious foods, which are vital for nourishing people. It's just not rice and fish, it's all foods that stem from water and land. And therefore, it is imperative that the Asian Mega-Deltas continue to be the home of vast amounts and diversity of foods, also in the face of climate change, or else many more people, especially the poor and vulnerable, will face food and nutrition insecurity. In order that the Asian Mega-Deltas can continue and expand in its provision of food and nutrition for a growing population, there are certain aspects that must be considered. A nutrition-sensitive approach, as we have heard before, must be employed, and we must use multiple entry points through a holistic food systems framework, not just production as we are used to, but also looking at the consumption patterns of different population groups, supply chains, and the policies and investments. Most importantly, solutions must be people-centered, and we also heard this from our last speaker, and must include consumers, supply chain actors, producers, small-scale, medium, and large, and importantly, the communities, but also the public and the private sectors and researchers. Consumer demands and consumer behavior are also among the youth are becoming increasingly important for meeting food and nutrition security. Importantly, we must not only take into account that production is the only channel to supply diverse, nutritious foods. We must also consider loss and waste, reducing the over 1/3 of food that's produced, and ensuring access to culturally acceptable, nutritious, diverse, and convenient food products, as those that stem from the foods that are produced. For example, complementary foods that include fish, other aquatic foods, and also rice and vegetables. If we do so, then the poor and vulnerable will also have a chance to be able to improve their food and nutrition security, and we will have a very important means of improving food and nutrition security that does not leave anyone behind. Importantly, the poor and vulnerable depend on markets, as many others, as we all do, depend on markets for access of foods. And this means that affordability as well as accessibility are important considerations, as well as consumer demands and changing food habits. The Asian Mega-Delta must therefore also be a source of income as an indirect pathway to food and nutrition security. We must ensure that the Asian Mega-Deltas are therefore resilient, inclusive, and productive now and in the future. Asian Mega-Deltas' food, land, and water systems must continue and expand its vital role in delivering diverse and nutritious foods. Change and adapt to climate change. We must ensure that they transform in ways that enhance food and nutrition security for all, leaving no one behind. And the capabilities of these systems for the people who depend on them now, and as we heard, up to the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, but also beyond. Let me give some concrete examples from the Asian Mega-Delta in Cambodia and then in Bangladesh. Our surveys from Cambodia show us that small fish and other aquatic foods are central in the diets and provide essential micronutrients and fatty acids. So climate impacts on fisheries, such as the increasing and unpredictable drought and rising water temperature, can have detrimental effects on production, productivity, and diversity of fish and other aquatic foods in the Mekong Delta, and therefore lead to worsening food and nutrition security of those who live in the Delta and those who depend on the Delta for their foods. Let us take another example from Bangladesh. The GCRF production that we see in Bangladesh is highly diverse. It produces rice for home consumption and sale, fish for the domestic market and household consumption, other aquatic foods, also high market value freshwater prawn and saline water shrimp for export, and huge quantities of seasonal vegetables, nuts and fruit, mostly for sale. And all this comes from small family farms. These systems are highly dynamic and constantly adapting and evolving in response to changing environment and market conditions, and thus seem quite resilient. So how can we build on these examples to ensure that responses to climate change impacts are resilient and continue to contribute to food and nutrition security? And one of the things that we have seen in building up and designing the One CGIAR initiative on the Asian Mega-Deltas, which is led by Ola Sander, is that our data, especially on the diversity of this complex Asian Mega-Deltas locations and the peoples, that our data are quite sparse and they are not disaggregated. So therefore, there is a call for investments in the research on the geographies and the peoples that make up the production systems of the Asian Mega-Delta in order that we can get full advantage towards improving food and nutrition security. We must make sure that there is a shift from feeding to nourishing in the Asian Mega-Delta's food systems and beyond. In addition to the quantity and energy as supplied by the major food crop rice, there must also be a focus on quality, the nutrition quality and the food safety of the food systems. This means meeting the nutritional requirements of different population groups. For example, the micronutrient requirement, minerals and vitamins such as calcium, zinc and iron, vitamin B12 and vitamin A, as well as essential fatty acids of women and children in the first 1,000 days of life. This is crucial for contributing to cognition, development and growth in children, and nutrition and well-being in adults, as well as protecting against overweight and obesity and the rapidly increasing prevalence of non-communicable diseases, such as diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. So therefore, let me stop here. Thank you very much. And let us build on the experience we have, get the data that we need, and also look at the ways in which the Asian Mega-Delta can develop and can use some of the examples we have for improving food and nutrition security for all, leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shakuntala. Just noting your last words, leaving no one behind. You mentioned that several times in your talk, and it was interesting to see your emphasis on how food and nutrition security and the solutions for that must be people-centered. And that, of course, then leads to issues of justice and governance, gender aspects, and all of those aspects and approaches, in order that we leave no one behind. And this leads us on very nicely to our next speaker, who's Dr. Anne Vu, who's based at Newcastle University. Anne is an interdisciplinary researcher. She brings expertise in development studies, political science, anthropology, and geography. She's got a wide range practitioner background in action research, in policy engagement, and in community building, with over 10 years of experience working with a range of donors, governments, and NGOs. She's published widely on environmentalism, environmental governance, geopolitics, land conflicts, etc. And so therefore, I can think no one better to talk to us now about how we deal with localizing the SDGs in the Asian Mega-Deltas. So Anne, over to you.
Thanks, Andy, for a very kind introduction. Let me share my screen. Could you see my screen? Okay. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to our colleagues in Asia. And it is my pleasure to be part of this timely and exciting event to discuss with you about SDG localization in the Asian Mega-Delta context. And for over the past 5 years, there is a significant policy debate on localizing the Global Agenda 2030 with 17 Sustainable Development Goals at the core of this agenda. And SDGs are supposed to be a universal agenda applying globally to all countries, but it is also supposed to be nationally owned and implemented, and it incorporates 3 interconnected dimensions of development: economic, social, and environmental. And these components are indivisible, meaning that you cannot realize the agenda without realizing it as a whole. So what does localization of SDGs mean? It means that SDGs allow every country to implement them in the way that is most relevant to their domestic context, and national governments are given a chance to propose their own sustainability models. But there are some cautions that we should be mindful of. Because SDGs are not legally binding and it advances the national ownership, so things can be business as usual in the national context. It means that environmental dimension, environmental sustainability can be ignored and economic growth can continue to be prioritized. So, and SDGs localization is one of the key components of the Living Deltas Hub where I am based. And we look at SDG localization in a very specific, unique context of deltas. And we already know that, and from the other presenters, we can see how important deltas are vital, important to supporting lives and livelihoods in the deltas. But at the same time, they are also very vulnerable to human impacts. Therefore, deltas really matter to achieving SDGs. And SDGs also matter to sustaining deltas as socio-ecological systems. So a key message that we want to highlight here is that localizing SDGs in the delta context need a nuanced understanding of these delta specificities, as well as the challenge and their risk profiles. And in the last two slides, I would like to draw the attention to some initial findings from our research. And so far, we found out that SDG localization in our 3 case study delta countries, Vietnam, India, and Bangladesh, do not recognize deltas as distinctive socio-ecological systems. And deltas are also missing in the SDGs implementation and review in these countries. And we have also identified some important significant gaps in the existing SDG national framework of these countries. First, there is a significant gap in the adaptation of ecological themes, which can be evidenced in the missing of many targets and indicators related to this theme that cut across different goals. And let me give you an example. In the goal 15, the global goal 15, life on land, covers both freshwater ecosystems, mountains, and forest. But the content of the goal 15 in the national SDG frameworks of Vietnam and Bangladesh remove all the components related to freshwater ecosystems, mangroves, and mountains. And as you can see from all the pictures I deliberately inserted in my slides, they reflect the vital importance of the freshwater ecosystems to people's daily lives in the delta context. But the adaptation of this theme in the SDG national framework is really troubling. And like the ecological theme, the adaptation of governance, human rights, and gender equality themes is also problematic in the SDG national framework. In Vietnam, for instance, all the indicators directly concerned with human rights are missing. But what we find interesting here is that the Vietnamese government actually do not reject human rights. Instead, it advocates their own perspective of human rights, which focus on economic, social, and cultural rights, and ignores the individualistic political and civil rights. So we need to be mindful of these local political specificities when we look at the SDG localization. And in terms of gender equality, for example, many targets and indicators related to this theme are not adapted in the national context, or where adapted, it is ambiguous and reductionist. And where indicators available, there is no available data to track the progress, or there's a lack of data disaggregation by gender. So when there's no data disaggregation, it's not easy to capture the progress in gender equality. And I want to spend the last 2 minutes of my presentation to talk about delta voices. And it's very great that in our meeting, in our event today, we can hear many delta voice, from the delta dwellers. Leaving no one behind is one of the underpinning principles of the SDGs. And SDG localization cannot be successful without meaningful and genuine participation of the multi-stakeholders, especially the groups that are at risk of being left behind, including women and girls. And in localizing SDGs, it is essential to identify and recognize officially who are the most vulnerable and the most marginalized groups, and identify different dimensions of discrimination against these groups. But in practice, a genuine engagement of civil society and wider community in SDG process is worrying, troubling, and these groups are not clearly identified. In Vietnam, for example, public engagement, civic engagement happens in an ad hoc and superficial manner, and the list of these groups is missing in the country's SDG documents. For example, in the Vienna, in the Voluntary National Review, or in the SDG Progress Report, these groups are missing. They are not identified, they are not indicated in these documents. So to conclude, in the SDG localization, you can see how much can be lost in translation to the national context. And our work tries to capture all of this dynamic. And the key message that we want to emphasize again here is, in the Delta context, SDGs is important to achieving Delta sustainability, and at the same time, Deltas are vital to achieving SDGs. So in order to bring SDG localization to success, we need to have a nuanced understanding of these Delta specificities, and any political and policy decision regarding SDGs need to be informed by these Delta specificities. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Anne, for that really helpful and expert insight into the SDGs in Delta regions. We were due to have one of our advisory board members, Salim Al-Hook, join us next. Salim is the director of ICAD and professor at the Independent University of Bangladesh, but Salim is in Scotland and maybe is struggling with the Scottish transport system between Edinburgh and Glasgow. So we'll move on in that case straight to our panel. If Salim comes later, we'll try and pop him in at the end of the session. But in the absence of Salim, it's a shame we would have heard more about locally led adaptation and how that's key. We'll move on to our panel, which will now discuss Delta voices and be a moderated discussion on the issues facing women and youth in the Deltas. And to do that, I'll pass on to my good colleague, Professor Tuhin Ghosh of Jagatpur University in Kolkata. So Tuhin, over to you.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to the session of Voices from the Delta. As we have already discussed from the earlier speakers, we have heard that the deltas are more important for the resources they are in. And in fact, the population in the deltas, all the global deltas, specifically in the Asian mega-deltas, are increasing. And that's why there is immense level of competition and pressure to the ecosystem services of the deltas. Along with that, there is climate change impacts, and often we actually forget that the deltas are not really terrestrial ecosystem, that is specifically very prominently an aquatic ecosystem. And we forget about the rivers, those are feeding the deltas, and we forget about the sediments from the upland, which is building up the deltas. So there are a lot of complex systems in the system of the delta, and social ecological systems are impacting. And that's why the pressure on the life and livelihood of the people and their subjective well-being, along with their aspirations, are tremendous. So I will not talk much. I think I have in this panel very prominent experts from different regions, and those who has their experience working on the ground and working on the community. So I would love to hear from them. That is good for all of us. And we have the experts from the Delta, the ground of the Delta, Rumana Pizzadi Hussein from the World Fish, Bangladesh. Unfortunately, she could not join, but she has shared one pre-recorded video, which after this we can see. And also she has raised one question. So other speakers, I will request to other speakers to respond to that question raised by Rumana. We have Indika Arulingam from IWMI, Sri Lanka. She has experience working in deltas, specifically in the Myanmar. And we have Mohammad Samsuddoha from CPRD, Bangladesh. He has a lot of experience on the ground and participatory mode of research and development, all these things. So I would like to have the video first shared by Rumana, and then we will proceed towards our discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon from Dhaka, and I'm Pirzadi Rumana Hussein from World Fish. We all know that Bangladesh is located within the dynamic delta of three large river basins, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and the Meghna of Asian Mega-Delta. In addition, sitting at the head of the Bay of Bengal and having Hindu Kush Himalayan region on its north, the climate of the country is mostly monsoon dominated. Therefore, the country is affected by large-scale interannual climate variability, like seasonal signature of extreme heat, heavy and mean precipitation changes. Considering this large-scale climate variability-induced risks in aquatic food systems, for instance, high temperatures exceeding the physiological tolerance level of aquatic plants, animals, and microorganisms, sudden temperature fluctuations leading to mortality, dry and cold spells triggering disease outbreaks, and erratic or intense rainfall events causing harvest losses, which are few among the challenges facing aquatic food production systems. We, jointly with our partners, developed a scalable, operationalized, ICT-based decision support system for communicating site-specific climate information services for aquaculture in Bangladesh and also in Odisha, India. The concept was with high-quality climate information and context-specific decision support services tailored to the needs of the aquatic food systems. Aquatic food producers, particularly youth and women, can be empowered to adapt and manage climate stress and thus offset the climate impacts. This is because women's engagement in secondary or supplementary fish farming activities, such as preparing feed, maintaining fishing nets, repairing equipment, sorting of fingerlings, and post-harvest processing, resulted not only restricted involvement in day-to-day aquaculture management operations, also restricted decision-making roles so far. So reflecting on this innovative digital approach of providing information and services to reduce climate risks and to increase resilience capacity for South Asian aquaculture system for sustainable production, and also reflecting on less participation of women and youth in aquatic food systems, I believe that ensuring access to climate information and enhancing climate services can promote women and youth's involvement in day-to-day management decisions and at the same time strengthen their decision-making role. So I'd like to take today's opportunity to raise this question: how do you think about this approach of providing reliable information and services to manage climate risks for ensuring sustainable aquatic food production, and at the same time empowering women and youth to strengthen their voice and decision-making role in aquatic food systems?
Thank you. So I would like to welcome again Indika and Doha in this discussion forum. And I will go to Doha first. I think he has experience in participatory research and development, all these aspects on the ground with the community. So what is your experience whether the people, as a generic sense, whether the people are really intended to come up with any kind of locally led adaptation? Is that their aspiration, or there is any enthusiasm from them? Please, though.
Thank you very much. Thank you for providing me scope to speak on, different research and also implementation perspective. I would like to build my comment and discussion on the video, what we have seen earlier from a rural women from rural men from Bangladesh, and also from the presentation from Pirjadev Rumana. Women is an advantaged segment of community, and the vulnerability are differentiated from the other people. One is for socio-cultural aspect, because they have not adequate access to resources. They don't have ownership to the common services, because livelihoods of the most of the people are depending on access to the resources. Ownership to the resources is not equal to the women as we have men. On the other hand, if we consider the vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, and the vulnerability also differentiated vulnerability, women has the double role in that they maintain livelihoods, they take care of the household, they also support the other family members in terms of resilience building and also reducing the risk. If I build an example from the coastal area of Bangladesh, particularly in the southern coast, people are facing huge scarcity of drinking water, and the women who collect water from maybe 5 or 10 kilometers away, they consume saline water, and it causes health problem and also problem in reproduction system and other things. Women are, there are another study in the Ganges area, Padma River basin area, that river bank erosion and displacement migration have increased child marriage. Essentially, displacement and migration and also other extreme events have increasing in Bangladesh, and they forces people to be displaced and migrated. And they are the men who migrate and left behind the women, and women become more exposed to the situation. They become trapped to the situation, and they also face socio-cultural exploitation and other violations. So if we consider the opportunity of the women, they have the opportunity to support adaptation and resilience building activities, to support household. On the other hand, they has the more vulnerability to impacts of climate change. Now, what we should do? We need some policy reframing, and also need to empower women. As Pirjadev Rumana said, that we need to support women with knowledge, information, and also technology for alternative livelihood development. We also need to support women so that they can have a good stake in the market. Market means not only living on the ground, also to make a bridge between the public sector, because in Bangladesh, public sector is expanding, and most of the public sector, private sector is expanding, and this is service sector. So if we build capacity of women so that they build capacity and can get an employment in the private sector, maybe in urban areas with good wages, so this can support to other family members who are living in the exposed areas. The other concern is that, as Andy Love said, today is the loss and damage day, and we are very vocal and campaigning, advocating for loss and damage support, loss and damage finance. But problem is that we might get some support from the international community, but we need to ensure that this support reaches to the climate vulnerable community, climate vulnerable people. This support addresses the gender segregated support to the women. this support also should ensure effective utilization of money. So when we talk about in global level, we create pressure for realizing the liability context, and also providing more money, mobilizing more money for the climate vulnerable people. On the other hand, we also think that the national government also should have the responsibility to ensure proper utilization of money. So I would like to stop here. Thank you.
Thanks to her. A lot of insights. I think we have to explore the experience from Myanmar, from Indica, and the same question goes to Indica, whether you have what is your experience from the ground working with the community, at how much enthusiastic or eager the youth and gender specifically in the local adaptation to overcome the risk and vulnerability in the specific delta.
Thank you, Tuhin. So I can talk about some of the livelihood risks and vulnerabilities faced by young people in the Irrawaddy Delta of Myanmar through a case study that we did on the livelihood aspirations and realities of youth from a fishing village in the Irrawaddy Delta. This research was funded by the CGIAR research program on fish agri-food systems led by WorldFish, and where the International Water Management Institute is a managing partner. The water-rich Irrawaddy Delta of Myanmar, also known as the country's rice bowl, is considered to be among the most productive regions in the country. Alongside this, however, lie high rates of poverty and inequalities in land distribution. For the many landless communities in the Delta, inland capture fisheries has historically been an important means of livelihood building alongside agricultural wage labor. Despite the centrality of inland fisheries to these households, the sector has frequently been marginalized in national development priorities, which have predominantly focused on improving paddy production in the Delta. In the fishing village we studied, inland fishing was a profitable activity until the construction of a polder system near the village in the 1980s. This is a trend that also took place across the Delta during this time for the purpose of land reclamation for paddy production. Thereafter, while more land did become arable, fishing yields in the village gradually depleted to nearly 1/4 of its previous value, as the changed agroecological conditions interfered with fish migration and spawning patterns. Despite these declining yields, inland fisheries continues to be an important source of livelihoods for the poorest and most marginal households in the village, who without land were unable to diversify into other alternatives. Within the village, fisheries is associated with low social status and social stigma. The landless and poor households were also excluded from political processes in the village, including village-level decisions on how the fishery resource is managed and fishing rights are distributed, where decision-making tended to be dominated by the larger landowners, some of whom were also fishers. The young people of the fisher households were among the first generations to encounter the impacts of the political transitions and economic growth experienced by Myanmar in the past decade. Connectivity to Yangon improved significantly and schooling became more widely available, although still relatively unaffordable for poorer households. Changing labor markets were associated with growing seasonal and long-term out-migration of young people, a trend more closely associated with the landless households in the village when compared to better-off households. Both the youth from the fisher households and their parents aspired for the youth to move away from fishing as a livelihood strategy, citing, among other reasons, the drudgery involved, its associations with poverty and low social status, lowering yields, and the emergence of other livelihood options. The growing mechanization of paddy production had diminished wage labor opportunities, particularly for females. Many of the larger landowners who had been able to mechanize rapidly pointed to the increasing uncertainty of rainfall as one of the main reasons for doing so. For many of the female youth from the fisher households, the expanding garment sector around Yangon offered new work opportunities, where young females were considered ideal workers. While these jobs were not highly paid, they were found to be less labor intensive when compared to the alternatives in the village and somewhat more prestigious. The female youth also stayed enrolled in education for longer. Many of the male youth, on the other hand, while aspiring to eventually migrate to urban areas, tended to drop out of school earlier to pursue wage labor in and around the village. However, growing levels of financial indebtedness in the community connected to rising inflation and changing lifestyles also saw an increasing number of these young men periodically migrating to work in the commercial raft fishery in the neighboring Gulf of Martaban. This work was through yearly contract labor and was highly risk-prone, with physical hardship, complete isolation for months, conflict, and serious health concerns and injury. However, the advance contract payment was viewed as one of the few ways of settling household debts for the landless and fisher households. Thus, the livelihood engagement and migration pattern of these young people and associated opportunities and risks were largely shaped by their social positioning related to gender and the class of the landless fisher households. For many of the male youth, the social, economic, and political changes of the past decade in Myanmar had converged with the historical exclusions and inequalities experienced by the fisher community to reproduce and further deepen livelihood vulnerabilities and risks. Over to you, Tuhin.
Thanks, Indika. So whatever we have found from your comments, your experience, and Doha's experience, that if I am not wrong, that the youth specifically, they have some intention to go out of the Delta, if you agree. So how do you think that we can come up with our agenda to achieve the success of the locally led adaptation? What would be the future of the Delta? Dominated or influenced by the youth if they are not in the Delta. So what is your experience?
So I can respond to this through the perspective on how we can bridge some of the constraints that youth, not only in the Delta, but all over the world typically face in building productive livelihoods in aquatic food systems. A recently released report by the Committee on World Food Security's high-level panel of experts, which was on youth employment and engagement in food systems, suggests that the equitable inclusion of youth in food systems and food system livelihoods can be an important component of transitions to food systems that are more sustainable and resilient. But that the realization of this potential rests on the recognition of young people's rights, equity, and agency, and their roles as recognition of their roles as agents of change across food systems. So I can maybe briefly talk about 5 areas of action for overcoming some of the constraints faced by young people in establishing productive and resilient livelihoods in aquatic food systems. The first is the lack of policies that support the rights and access of youth, including different groups of youth, such as young women, to use and to protect land and water resources, and that can facilitate the intergenerational transfer of these rights, as well as incentivizing initiatives that can facilitate youth access to resources as well as to markets and financial services, which typically discriminate against young people and are a big constraint to youth building productive livelihoods in food systems. There is also a need for educational and training programs that equip youth for livelihoods in aquatic food systems and the facilitation of indigenous and other locally specific knowledge transfers. We also need to support youth as knowledge generators in their own rights. There's also a need for employment and labor market policies and interventions that can provide decent and meaningful employment for young people in aquatic food systems and protect them against the exploitation that we see so frequently when it comes to youth engagement in food systems, and also compensate for young people's unpaid contributions to food system livelihoods. There is also a need to guarantee and encourage the active and equal participation of young people and their leadership in formal and informal mechanisms that govern aquatic food systems, including community fisher groups, civil society, national and local decision-making spaces, as well as support for youth initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I contribute, please?
Yes, sure. I was intended to go to you. Please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This is very great question. And in Bangladesh, this is so relevant because the number of young people will increase over the years. And if we consider Bangladesh context, economic context, we see that more young entrepreneurship from both men and women, adolescent girls and boys have increased, and they're self-grown. And most of them are doing cash crop. For instance, a rural youth when he become educated, he or she is not comfortable in agriculture because they consider agriculture is not that smart job in a rural cultural context. So they try to do some entrepreneurship and they go for cash crop like fish farming, like vegetable cultivations and crab fattening in the coastal areas, cow rearing, poultry rearing, and they are self-grown. They face some challenges also identified by Indica. I think I'm right. Okay. Challenges. One is access to resources, both financial resources, institutional resources, and also other resources like land and also entitlements. So they should have enhanced access or increased access to those resources. The other thing is marketing, because marketing is not structured and they cannot get more profit out of marketing. So a standard value chain and supply chain should be established with the participation of young entrepreneurs so that they can get maximum profit or benefit out of their primary product. The third one is that geographical preference. If I consider Bangladesh, the entrepreneurship are still agriculture based, and there are different agricultural preference in different areas. For instance, the coastal areas, agricultural preference is different. People do shrimp farming, crab fattening, and in the shore areas, in vegetable cultivation, cash crops, and also in other areas, poultry, livestock, fisheries in Mymensingh. So we should have a geographical preference of the scopes of entrepreneurship development, and should build capacity of those young coming entrepreneurs on the particular skills. And again, they need to include or link them up to the institutional support and also government support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doha and Indica. I think we have to consider the gaps in the governance. And what is your suggestion that what we need to do for overcoming this situation to keep the youth in the Delta and come up with some locally led adaptation success? That's in that way. So you can start. I think Doha, you can contribute. You can provide your comment first. I think there is some technical problem. I think Indica, if you can, please comment.
I think one thing that is needed is the need for both alongside productive rural economies in fishing or farming that both Doha and I talked about, the need for productive and thriving non-farming rural economies that could provide livelihoods for young people. And this is connected to many things that rural areas lack, such as access to infrastructure, roads, electricity, and for young people, especially internet and broadband access. Something else that rural areas lack adequate health and educational and water and sanitation services. So the need to address this and to make sure that rural areas are thriving economies that can offer both farming and non-farming jobs for young people, I think is an important consideration.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to add something with this. When you talk about governance essentially comes with institutions. So in Bangladesh, and also I believe that also in India, the institutions are centralized. I mean, all decisions come from central level, not even from the divisional level. In Bangladesh, we have grassroots level institution, but that grassroots level institution, we call it, you call it panchayat, we call it union parishad, they are not properly resourced, they are not properly educated. So, and also we need a stronger institutional linkage from the central to local level with very focused messages on young entrepreneurship development, so that young entrepreneur can get support from the local institution. This support may be from leasing land from the local government, and also having finances from the local banks and institutions, training support from the other ministries and also local governments, and also a kind of leadership development. Because when we talk about market linkage and also supply chain development, they also need to engage in the marketing chain, and the marketing chain is very long, and marketing chain is very exploitative. So if we want to establish a direct market linkage from the ground to the central level, maybe capital level, to the private sector, so we need some leadership capacities and organizing capacities of the young entrepreneurs. So I think this also should be supported with training and capacity building, so that they can build their own leadership and can get access to the market.
Okay, thank you so much. It would be great to continue the discussion, but we have time limitations and we need to wrap up. And I think that's nice insights from both the experts. Thank you very much. Thank you, Indika. Thank you, Doha. And I would like to wrap up the session. Thank you, everybody. And I would like to hand over to Andy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tuhin, and also thank you very much, Indika and Doha, for your expert in interventions. Extremely good. Just to wrap up now, we're just coming to the end, but we have a sort of important 5 to 10 minutes with Andy Henderson, our Deputy Director, one of the Deputy Directors of our Living Deltas Hub, where we want to discuss action for the future, because there's no point stopping now. We know that things are getting much more worse more rapidly, as Ole's introduction says. And so I'll hand over to Andy now to talk about a top 10 action list for the future.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Thanks all to the speakers and panelists. This is where you as participants come in and they get a chance to have a say in certainly some thoughts we've had about actions for future research and development. And I just want to quickly go through, we've developed a list of 10. And at the end of this presentation, there will be something called a Menti. And the idea is the device you're on, you can just quickly log into your web browser. We'll give you a little web code. And then you can vote on what you think the top 3 priorities should be for actions for future research and development programs on Asian megadeltas. Obviously, we've covered a lot of some of the issues. We haven't covered them all. And some of those might be missing. And obviously, if you think in our top 10 there are anything missing, then please put that in the chat. But I just want to quickly run through this, and then at the very end, we'll show a slide. And as you vote for your top 3, those votes will come in and you'll be able to see and get instant feedback as to where your votes might be actually pushing the top 3. Okay. So one of the things we've kind of discussed is that, you know, long-term investments in research programs that are climate smart and contextually appropriate technologies are needed to realize transformative social change, particularly in terms of inclusive solutions. Often funding is piecemeal or doesn't actually continue once a project is finished. Any research should center on co-producing, co-creating approaches that consider traditional and indigenous knowledge, Delta dwellers, their practical knowledge, as well as global scientific knowledge. How do we harness those together? There are also power asymmetries that we should really think about, and it includes, but it's not limited between those between women and men, obviously. So gender, we have class, caste, religion, and other social identities that need to be considered within these solutions. And they really need to address social inequalities, including things like poverty, nutrition, and food insecurity. Now, these are themes we've touched on today, particularly with our speakers. Any kind of research and development should really acknowledge that inherent power imbalance that exists between researchers and the communities that we work in, and seek to ensure that the community members are included in all research from the kind of the realization of the idea to the actual analysis and through. So what's crucial to understand what influences youth perception. So youth are kind of crucial to everything that we do. They need to have viable livelihood options, particularly overcoming entry barriers where we need to get young people are engaged in meaningful decision making. And we've already touched on the problems that youth face in terms of accessing these sorts of developments of livelihood and decision making, particularly because they will be the custodians of our sustainable ecosystem management. Nature-based solutions are needed to be really an integral part of everything that we developed on Asian Mega-Deltas, because this is the kind of the backbone of resilience of livelihoods, and we're dependent on those natural resources. We also need to acknowledge that there's a complex relationship between cultural heritage and livelihoods, and that needs to be considered when we look at understanding or approaching location-specific impacts of human activities and environmental change. Obviously, it won't be one size fits all. We need to really consider where we're working in terms of the Asian Mega-Delta system. And then hopefully that leads to the co-creation of appropriately integrated technical and social solutions with diverse stakeholders as required to meet the challenges of the Asian Mega-Deltas. And as we've outlined, there are a number of challenges that these communities face. And then in terms of restoring landscapes, both within upstream of deltas, it's critical to enable climate resilience and opportunities for food system innovation. And the way to tackle this is transdisciplinary science, multi-actor dialogues. Networks are key to moving from policy to practice, and it's coherent that it's all mutually supportive and it links across all levels of governance. And that's essential to optimize landscape scale adaptation. So we have the local and we have the landscape. So I've quickly run through those 10. These 10 lists will be linked in the Menti, and if I stop sharing my screen, Livy will now share the Menti web page. There we go. So what we're asking you to do is, if you go to www.menti.com and put the code 46778904 in, you will see that there's this list of 10 different things that you think are most critical in securing Asian Mega-Delta resilience. And what we're looking to define are the top 3, because this will be part of our feedback in terms of feedback into the resilience hub in terms of solid outputs from what we think our participants think in terms of what they think are the most 3 important things that we should really focus our energies on for any kind of future research and development programs within Asian Mega-Deltas. So if you'd like to start voting now, then this Menti page should start to change. There we go, brilliant. Give it a couple more minutes for more people to vote, and then we'll just quickly summarize the top 3. Okay, it looks like it's flowing down a bit in terms of its voting. So based on kind of the audience participation here and the attendees, we're still going one more. Very close in terms of number 1 and number 2 at the moment in terms of human nature-based solutions, and looking at appropriate technical and social solutions. And just below that is co-production and co-creation. So this is really setting the local communities at the heart of all that we do in terms of how we consider our approaches to dealing with the multitude of problems that Asian mega-deltas face certainly in terms of climate change and adaptation and resilience. Okay, so thank you all for participating today. It was a pleasure to have you along, and it's good to see so many people join this session. If there is any further information you'd like, please contact ourselves at Living Deltas or CGIAR in the Asian Mega-Deltas portfolio. With that, I would like to thank all my speakers, all the panelists, some really informative discussion there, some really informative speakers, and hope those of you who are in Asia, I hope that you have a good evening, and for the rest who are based in the UK, we hope you have or Europe, we hope you have a good day. Okay, thank you.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much. That's great. Bye-bye.
Thank you and goodbye.